Hi, and welcome to this week's Wu Wei Wisdom Life Lessons teaching. It's great to be back with you all. This week, we are talking all about childhood trauma and addictions. Now, are you or anyone you know addicted to an unhealthy lifestyle habit? This could be overeating, drug taking, drinking too much, gambling. Well, if so, this teaching is for you. We'll be digging deep to reveal the origin of these adult addictions, which is often found in childhood. You'll also discover how your mind and inner child work so hard to keep these unhealthy addictions alive within you today. And this deeper understanding will help you finally break free of these addictions. Okay, David, in your experience of working with clients who are suffering from addictions, how is their childhood experiences affecting these addictions?
Well, I find there is definitely a link there. And so an addiction is normally something that they believe that they have no control over. So they are a victim to the addiction, whether that's drinking too much, as you said in the introduction, gambling, overeating, or undereating. It could be OCD. So it's almost like something is overpowering them and they're being dragged along by this invisible force of what they would call an addiction.
But does that belief that they have no control over their behaviours, does that start in childhood?
In my experience, it nearly always does. I mean, it's just from my experience. So it nearly always starts from a very early age when they're desperately clinging on to something that they can rely on, something that's regular. I mean, we talk a lot in these videos and we use a word, and the word itself sounds very benign and not very powerful. But I've come to understand it's an extremely powerful word. And the word is familiarity. And so when you're a child, you will cling to any familiarity, even if you know that it's not healthy in the long run, but it's something that you're used to doing. And in that action of doing it, this familiarity becomes very soothing and very calming.
Yeah.
And so this will then develop and carry on into adulthood.
So I guess when we were children, most of us, even if we are suffering from addictions now as an adult, we didn't necessarily overeat or gamble or take drugs when we were a young child to have some form of control or some form of self-soothing. If we developed that type of behavior as an escape, if you like, what were we doing as a child compared to what we're doing now as an adult? Because it must have been different.
Well, you mentioned in the title about trauma. And so it normally follows that when you're a child, there was one event or a series of events that was very overpowering, very intense for you. And so the child is looking for some kind of soothing or comfort or something that they can rely on. And so even something like the overeating, that could happen in childhood, that they're eating the wrong thing and they get some form of satisfaction from having a full stomach or from getting their own way or being in control. Or alternatively, because we'll be talking about the emotional pendulum in this video, be the other way of not eating enough and trying to control their food intake. So they'll be in a position because of the trauma where they perceive that they're out of control or they are out of control, and they're looking and grasping for something that puts them back into some kind of control.
And I guess, so these type of situations in childhood, traumatic situations, what would they be? Can you give me examples?
Well, it could be something as serious as abuse, physical, emotional, or mental abuse. It can be something as dysfunctionality in their home life. It could be bullying at school. It could be a sense of unfairness, injustice, could be that they believed that they wasn't loved or didn't have any worth or they wasn't valued. So there can be a lot of emotional basis. You see, all of those have emotional basis. And so the word trauma is very useful because the child will go and not be able to deal with this emotional trauma. And so they look for something that gives them some form of control.
So, yeah, I can definitely I can imagine that as a young child, if we experienced any of those spectrum of events or situations that you've just described, because we didn't necessarily understand what was going on,
Absolutely.
it will create a massive tsunami, powerful wave of uncomfortable emotions within us. And
helplessness.
And a sense of helplessness.
Yes, completely helpless. It's almost like you're drowning and you don't understand the territory around you. And so you're looking to hook onto something that is something that you do think you're in control of, something that gives you control.
So we develop a behaviour which is an unhealthy behaviour in order to re-establish what we believe we're re-establishing some form of control, and also to self-soothe.
Yes. And then what happens, Alex, is that part of the mind that we call the inner child takes that and it clicks into this familiarity. And this familiarity for a lot of my clients is very powerful. Now, they will say, well, it's easier, or they will say it's my nature, or they will say it's ingrained. So if you've used any of these words, it's ingrained, I can't help it, or the common one, it's a habit. But I always say a habit is just a choice that you have set on default. So you're making choices deep in your subconscious mind, or I would call the inner child. When you were a child, you didn't have any alternatives. That was the only thing that would seem logical and open for you to do. So it's a form of avoiding or moving away or hiding from a situation where you are more in control. But then over time, this becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. And so over time, as you mature, this compulsive behavior or habitual behavior or whatever you want to call it actually takes away all of your power, and you become the victim to the addiction or the habit or the ingrainedness, and you see yourself as a victim and being dragged along by this way of acting and thinking and behaving.
And I would say, David, that the addiction, of course, over time, we'd say drug taking, drinking too much, or any sort of extreme unhealthy lifestyle habit, there is then a chemical knock-on effect which makes the addiction more alive within us, more hard to extract ourselves from. But originally, what I'm hearing you saying, David, is that we're not addicted to the food per se, or the alcohol per se, or the drugs per se. We are addicted and hooked into the cycle of behaviour as a means of avoiding the uncomfortableness of the emotions.
I am saying that, Alex, but you brought up a point that I was going to bring up a little bit later, but very important. But if you use some kind of a chemical, alcohol or eating, then you are almost creating another problem.
Yeah.
So you've still got the original problem, and then you've created another chemical dependency problem.
Yeah.
So now you've got two problems, and this is where you really need a clear head and clear thinking and a clear understanding of what you're dealing with, because these two can kind of interweave together and cause you kind of really big confusing issue. And when I've worked in my career with people who have drug problems, I've always found the base of it is the emotion. And that's what you've got to deal with first, in my experience. You've got to deal with the core of the problem. Yes, the addictive behavior, addicted to the chemical, is very difficult to throw off, but you'll never throw it off whilst the emotional driver, if you want to use that word, is still in place, because all you're doing is you're changing. And this is why a lot of people will say, well, stop smoking, but then start eating too much, or stop drinking and start doing something else. So what they're doing is they're moving their soothing on to other people. And then they'll say, well, I'm an addictive personality. But in my experience, it's because they've never dealt with the original core emotional problem. That's what you have to deal
So,
with.
just to be clear, in a way, what you've talked about is as adults, we can leapfrog from one addiction to the other because actually the problem was not the food or the alcohol
Yes.
or the drugs. The problem was the addiction to the behaviour, the addiction to the avoidance of the problem. And so as a child, we may have had a behaviour where we locked ourselves in our room and played video games, 20 hours a day, or some sort of extreme childish behaviour. And because that was our avoidance, we didn't want to face up to the trauma, the emotions. And we've just leapfrogged as an adult to put some more adult accessible addictions onto that. So alcohol, drugs, food.
And that's a great example, Alex, of a child who locks themselves away and gets stuck into computer games or reading or in their own little world. But remember the pendulum. It can also swing the other way. For those children who are very disruptive at school, very aggressive, have lots of problems, lots of issues. And so this is the emotional pendulum that we talk about in many videos. And look in the archives. It's a very powerful thing to understand. And so if you swing from the example that you use, so if you locking yourself away and cutting yourself off from society, and they're all swinging the other way, where you're becoming disruptive, very angry, very aggressive. So this is how not dealing with the initial emotional issue is really the key. And that's why we do these videos, to say, let's find what these situations are and don't respond emotionally, but look at how you solve the problem.
And before we look at the actual emotional issue that we're avoiding and pick that apart a little bit more, I just wanted to ask you one more question about the kind of when this starts. A lot of people would say, I have this addiction now because it's just my nature. And I think you've already mentioned that. But a lot of people would say, I'm just like my father was, or I'm just like my mother was. She had a problem with drinking. He had a problem with gambling. And I'm just copying them. Are the same kind of issues of avoidance involved in with that?
It's a really good point again, because that goes back to the emotional pendulum. So, and it'd be a good thing if you're watching this and recognize some of the things I'm saying, but obviously it won't all apply to you. Because what children do, they either mimic and copy exactly. I wish I had $1 for every client who've said to me over the years, I'm just like my mother or my father, I'm just the same. Because we either copy, and so if you've had a parent who is not very good at dealing with their emotions, and they become hypersensitive, or they repeat actions, or they become addicted to drink or alcohol in some form, or smoking or gambling, yes, it's quite rightly, as you say, quite easy rather for you to mimic that and copy that behavior. But you could also swing the other way and reject that behavior completely, and almost say, I'm never going to touch a drop. I'm never going to have a cigarette. I'm never going to go into a betting shop. I'm never going to do that. And so that's a great example of the emotional pendulum. And why we do these videos is to say, come off the extreme and find the center, which is wu wei, being in your flow, taking responsibility for you. And that's finding your way forward. That's you flourishing, not as a mimic or a rejection, but find your way where you take responsibility and accountability for what you think, what you believe, how you act, what you eat, what you drink, how many times you wash your hands, that you're in control and you're not responding or a victim to other things.
What about if someone says, I didn't have an addictive personality. I was absolutely fine till I had an extremely traumatic experience in my adulthood.
Yes, so it's not unknown. It's very unusual when it is just a one-off incident, or doesn't matter whether it's traumatic, but that has led to what we're talking about, an addiction in some form. What that normally identifies is there was a grounding before the incident where they were very unstable. So it's almost like I kind of think about it as though the incident, we have a saying in the UK, the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's almost like the incident tips them
Yeah,
over. The incident in the adult love
yeah,
tips them over, but the foundations
yeah,
that was already set where they were very unsure, where they wasn't taking responsibility. So the incident in the adult life has kind of tipped them
yeah.
over. It's very rare that if you have some traumatic incident, don't we have in our adult life, but it's very rare that you will go to a compulsive or addictive behaviors unless there is some groundwork that makes that incident more powerful.
In childhood. So
Yes.
what you're saying is the seed for the avoidance, emotional avoidance, because when we have a traumatic incident in our adulthood, we get that, again, that tsunami of negative, uncomfortable, painful emotions. We don't know how to deal with them. We may not have thankfully had that such an experience up until now in our adult life, but it's almost like we go to some sort of default and we will recall when we were in a childhood, this is what we did to avoid the emotions. This is what we did to self-soothe. So the seed has been planted, even though it hasn't necessarily been fertilized until the adult experience.
Yeah, the example that you're using is quite a good example because I've come across it several times in my career, and it would normally be alcohol. So they normally go to the bottle. They go to the bottle to hide, to shut away, to hide themselves away. And so you see, there is a kind of a seed there before that they believe that a bottle or drinking too much or alcohol is somehow going to help them. They know that alcohol is not going to help this situation, but they're looking for some kind of a running away, a hiding, a moving away, of submerging themselves, of not being responsible and facing up to the issue, no matter how traumatic, scary, and frightening it is. And it could be the loss of somebody you love, a partner, a child. But you know that going to the bottle or eating too much or doing something else is not going to assist the situation. But what they're saying is, it's too much for me. I can't cope with it. So I need somewhere to go and hide, or I need something else. That they know that drinking too much is never going to help them, or eating too much is never going to help them. So it's like they're driven by some idea that they can't cope, that it's too much for them, that they can't deal with this. They kind of surrender to the situation instead of facing the situation.
And so would you say, David, in your experience of working with clients with addictions, that making that choice to self-soothe in the short term rather than deal with the bigger long-term issue is a choice that is more often than not made?
Yeah, I absolutely accept that you have to be very careful on this, and I'm only giving my imperial experiences over 45 years of practice, and I've worked with many hundreds of clients with drink problems and drug problems, and I can't think of one where it wasn't the case that we are dealing with an emotional issue that's been covered up by whatever the addiction is. So what they're seeing is the addiction is the covering up, but actually the emotional problem always stays in place until you address it. When I work with a client in such a way, it can be very challenging because they can be very either surrendering and cry and can't deal with it, or they can be very aggressive back to me. It's very difficult to get through that top layer of the addiction to get through to what the problem actually is. But I believe that's the way you have to do it. I know out there that some people would disagree and say you have to deal with the addiction first. But for me, you have to deal with the fundamental root, the ground of the problem, before you deal with the addiction of the problem. Because if you don't, it just transfer, or my goodness, I'll promise you the world, and then a week later they're still back drinking or still back doing whatever they're doing because the real problem hasn't been solved. So the key to this, as always in the Wu Wei wisdom model, is you have to get to the core, the heart, the foundation, whatever you want to call it, the root. You have to get down to that problem and solve that problem. And then you have to do the work to solve as all the other issues.
So the root problem then, David, this emotional issue, what is it? And is it essentially the same thing for all clients with addictions?
Well, again, it's very difficult, Alex, because as everyone is unique, as you know, when I work with clients, you have to deal with everyone with a uniqueness and understand their story and how they got to this place. So we can only be general in these videos, of course. I'm sure you understand that. But it will be a issue in their childhood, normally very traumatic issue, some kind of abuse. It's normally some kind of abuse. Doesn't always have to be, of course. I'm talking in general terms, but it's some kind of abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual. And they have not been able to understand or to deal with it or to address it. So what they try and do is to hide it away, is to bury it, sweep it under the carpet. I mean, I hear all these different terms: forget about it, lock it away, shut it away. And then that's when they create the other problems. And really the way to do it is to go back and find that original problem, which will be unique to the client. Once you got through and understood that there is a problem here, what is the problem? How do you deal with that? How do you address that? Then surprisingly enough, I'm not always successful, I've got to be truthful, but the success rate is very good because nobody's ever really gone down to find the root of the problem. They've always dealt with their addiction rather than dealing with the root of the problem. And I would prefer to bypass their addiction in the first place, go to the root of the problem, then work my way back up to the addiction.
Yeah.
So it's like doing it the reverse way around.
And with a lot of addictions, David, people want to hide the addictions. They want to keep hold of them. So they can become very manipulative and untruthful because of the desire to keep in place this, what they believe is this safety or this comfort for themselves. Is it hard to do while the person is addicted or the client is addicted? Is it hard to get down because it's about getting the client to open up and be truthful, speaking to the inner child in a truthful way? Is it more difficult because part of the client is used to kind of manipulating situations, lying to keep the comfort, the addiction in place? Does it make it more challenging for you and for them in order to get to this root core problem?
Yes, I would say yes, without a doubt. And one of the things you have to do with that type of a client is build up a trust, that they trust that you're not going to do anything that's going to embarrass them, show them up, or make fun of them, or criticize them, or compare them. And more importantly, be judgmental. Normally you'll see there's a judgmental factor in this about the way they judge themselves or others have judged them. So the first few sessions, it is about building up that trust, because they've got to go to a place where they really do not want to go to. They've got to dig down into their psyche to go to a place that for all of their lives they've buried and covered over and layered layers and layers of deceit and dishonesty. And so to try and take them there back to that core is a great challenge. I always think, though, if somebody's willing to come to you and to have that first discussion, they must know. And lots of my clients have tried many other therapies and ways of doing it as in the past, but it's never quite worked. You've got to go down to that core. I believe that would be my teaching. Other teachers have different ideas. You know, you deal with the alcohol, or you deal with the eating, or you go on diets. For me, it's going down to the core first, dealing with the emotional issue, finding the balance there, finding what it is that you believe about yourself, about seeing yourself in the real light of truth, honesty, and integrity, of seeing it doesn't matter what addictions you've had. You know, one thing that absolutely I know without one shadow of a doubt, it cannot take away the candle light of your Shen. That light inside of you, that true Shen of who you are, that spirituality. It doesn't matter what you've been done. Once you can find your way through, and what comes to mind as I'm talking to you, it's like a minefield. You have to plan your way through the minefield. In some sessions, you move on quite quickly. Some sessions, you have to take 2 or 3 steps back because you're working your way through the minefield to get to the core. And the core is Shen. And we all have Shen, I believe this. And it doesn't matter what you've been doing to yourself. That Shen, that light is still shining bright. And you have to connect the person back to that original light of who they are.
And that's so true, David, because that Shen, or the kind of spiritual, authentic essence of who we really are, as we've kind of lost sight in that because for many people, the addiction and the addictive story has become their identity. It's become all-consuming. It's become who they are. It's become how they're labeled by other people.
And how they label themselves.
Yeah.
And how they label themselves. So they stop seeing themselves as some divine and awesome human being. They see themselves as somehow lesser or not good enough. You know, the 3 lies, not being able to cope, having no value. And so the word identity is very important in this work because you've got to find your way through that minefield that they've set up. And you see, all of this, there's lots of variations on this, Alex, you know, because addiction can also be seen as a misguided protection.
Yeah.
They're protecting themselves. They're keeping people away. A lot of people with weight problems, they wouldn't be able to verbalize this, but they're doing it to keep people away or to prove a point that they're not good enough, you know. So it's a very complicated minefield you have to work your way through, but you have to do that. And I think it's interesting us talking about this because I think that this is one of the things that differs the Wu Wei model from other models is this idea of this Shen, this spirituality of who you are. And I don't mean some kind of supernatural being or thing, angels or crystals. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a very natural thing of who you are as a human being. And it's to really do this correctly, you've got to go back to that core and you've got to reboot and rebuild from that original core of who you are. You are an amazing person. You are awesome. And if you've made mistakes, then you have to learn from those mistakes. But do not keep on repeating the same mistakes, hoping that somehow it's going to sort itself out. You've got to go back to the core, reboot and rebuild, and find your true essence of who you are. Awesome, unique. There is no one in the universe like you. And this life that you got is very precious. And you can achieve great things if you connect to that Shen and start living your truth.
Thank you, David. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this teaching and found it inspiring. Please do comment and let us know what you think, and also share it with someone else who you think may also benefit from the teaching. I will put links in the show notes to other related teachings which will also help you with this subject. David works every week with clients all over the world on addictions and inner child issues and childhood trauma issues. So if you'd like to learn more about David's video call consultations, I will also put a link in the show notes to those as well. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We produce new teachings every week and we would love to share your journey with you. Bye-bye.